Desert Bride was bought at auction like cattle. Until a Lawman outlaw staked his claim by gun, she was sold like cattle at a desert auction for $50. Until a mysterious lawman with a blood debt stepped from the shadows, drew his gun, and claimed her as his own. What happened next will break your heart and restore your faith in love. The sun hung like a copper coin over Perdition Wells, casting long shadows across the dusty main street where a crowd had gathered around the makeshift platform. Elena Morales stood there in her faded black dress, the same one she'd worn to bury her husband 6 months ago. The fabric clung to her thin frame, and her dark hair was pulled back so tight it made her cheekbones sharp as knife blades. She kept her eyes fixed on the distant mountains, refusing to look at the faces below, men with tobacco-stained teeth and hungry eyes. Men who saw her as nothing more than another piece of livestock to be bought and sold. "Now, gentlemen," called out Jeremiah Hicks, the town's self-appointed auctioneer, his voice carrying over the crowd like gravel in a tin cup. "We got ourselves a fine specimen here. Elena Morales, widow of the late Miguel Morales. Good cook, hard worker, still got her breeding years ahead of her." Elena's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. This was the price of her husband's debts. The bank had already taken their small farm, their few cattle, even Miguel's old guitar. All that remained was her, and the law said a woman's debts could be settled by marriage if no other means presented themselves. "Bidding starts at $50, Hicks announced, mopping sweat from his forehead with a dirty handkerchief. "60, called out old Sam Porter, who ran the general store. His wife had died 2 winters back, and everyone knew he'd been drinking himself to death ever since. "75, this from Jake Morrison, a drifter who'd been hanging around town for the past month, living off poker winnings and whatever odd jobs he could find. Elena closed her eyes and let the voices wash over her like a fever dream. This wasn't how she'd imagined her life would unfold. At 26, she thought her story was written: a good husband, maybe children someday, a small piece of land to call their own. Instead, here she stood like a mare at market. $100. The voice cut through the others like a blade through silk. Dutch Kessler stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow across the platform. The cattle baron owned more land than any man had a right to, stretching from the river to the foothills. His face was weathered as old leather, with eyes the color of winter sky. When he smiled, it never reached those eyes. The crowd fell silent. Dutch Kessler wasn't a man to be outbid, and everyone knew it. "Going once," Hicks called out, his voice suddenly uncertain. He knew Dutch's reputation as well as anyone. "Going twice." Elena finally looked down at the faces below. Porter had stepped back, his shoulders sagging. Morrison had already melted into the crowd. Only Dutch remained, his pale eyes fixed on her like she was already his property. "Sold to $500. The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. Every head turned toward the saloon, where a figure stepped out from the shadows of the wooden porch. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that touched his shoulders and a face marked by sun and hardship. A silver star gleamed dully on his vest, tarnished with age and wear. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She'd never seen him before, but something about his presence made the air itself seem to hold its breath. Dutch's face darkened like a storm cloud. Well, Caleb Rivers. Heard you were dead." The stranger, Caleb, walked forward with the easy gait of a man comfortable with violence. His hand rested casually on the grip of his Colt .45, and Elena noticed his knuckles were scarred white with old fights. "Not dead, Dutch. Just patient." His voice was quiet, but it carried in the desert air like distant thunder. "That woman's mine." Dutch laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You got $500, Lawman? Because I doubt a washed-up marshal carries that kind of money." Caleb stopped just 10 feet from the platform, his eyes never leaving Dutch's face. "I said she's mine. Didn't say anything about money." The crowd began to murmur and shift, sensing the electricity in the air. Men started backing away, creating a wide circle around the two figures. Elena found herself holding her breath. "See, Dutch," Caleb continued, his voice still soft but carrying an edge like broken glass. "You owe me a debt. Been 3 years since your boys killed my wife. Figured it was time to collect. Dutch's hand moved toward his gun, but stopped when he saw how still Caleb had become. The marshal's stance was loose, relaxed, but Elena recognized the coiled tension of a rattlesnake ready to strike. That badge don't mean nothing out here, Rivers. This is my town now. Badge means everything out here. Caleb's fingers flexed once, then went still. Question is, you gonna pay your debt peaceful like? Or do I have to take it out of your hide? The desert wind picked up, sending dust devils dancing across the street. Elena felt the fine grit against her skin, tasted it on her lips. Tom seemed to stretch like taffy in the heat. Dutch's eyes flicked from Caleb to the crowd, calculating odds. He was fast with a gun. Everyone knew that. But there was something about the way Caleb stood there, patient as stone, that gave even Dutch pause. This ain't over, Dutch said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. He stepped back, but his eyes promised violence to come. Caleb nodded once. Never expected it to be. He looked up at Elena for the first time, and she saw something in his dark eyes she couldn't name. Pain, maybe, or recognition of a fellow traveler on a hard road. Ma'am, he said, touching the brim of his hat. Reckon you, and I got some talking to do. Elena stood there on the platform, the afternoon sun beating down on her shoulders, and wondered if she'd just been saved or claimed by something far more dangerous than Dutch Kessler's gold. As Caleb extended his hand to help her down from the platform, she caught the scent of leather and gunpowder, and something else, the wild, untamed smell of a man who'd ridden too many lonely trails under too many empty skies. He'd worn that badge with honor once, until they killed his wife and unborn child, turning him into a ghost who haunted the frontier with nothing left to lose. The horse beneath Elena was a steady bay mare, her gait smooth as water flowing over stone. They'd been riding for 3 hours now, leaving Perdition Wells as nothing more than a smudge of dust on the horizon behind them. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, painted in shades of gold and rust under the afternoon sun. Elena sat behind Caleb on the saddle, her arms wrapped around his waist out of necessity rather than comfort. She could feel the tension in his shoulders, the way his muscles stayed coiled like a spring wound too tight. His badge caught the light when he turned, the silver tarnished black around the edges. "Where are you taking me?" she asked finally, her voice nearly lost in the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. "Away," was all he said. The word hung between them like smoke. Elena studied the back of his neck, where dark hair curled against sun-darkened skin. A thin white scar ran from his left ear to his collar, old but still visible. She wondered how many scars a man like this carried, and how many of them went deeper than flesh. "That's not an answer." Caleb's shoulders shifted slightly. "It's the only one I got right now." They rode in silence for another mile before Elena felt the fight drain out of her. What did it matter where they were going? She had no home to return to, no family waiting. Miguel's death had left her more alone than she'd ever imagined possible. "Why?" she asked instead. "Why did you do it? Back there, I mean." This time Caleb was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough as sandpaper. "Dutch Kessler owes me a debt. Been carrying it for 3 years now." "What kind of debt?" "The kind that can't be paid with gold." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd heard stories about men like this. Men who'd lost everything and had nothing left but revenge. Men who were more ghosts than flesh, haunting the frontier with their grief. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western mountains when Caleb finally reined in the mare beside a cluster of Joshua trees. Their twisted arms reached toward the sky like the hands of penitents seeking forgiveness. "We'll camp here," he said, swinging down from the saddle. He reached up to help Elena down, his hands careful around her waist. For a moment their eyes met, and she saw something flicker in his dark gaze. Surprise, maybe, as if he'd forgotten how to touch another person with gentleness. Elena busied herself gathering what dry brush she could find while Caleb tended to the horse. The silence between them had weight now, heavy with unspoken questions. When he finally got a small fire going, the flames cast dancing shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp planes of his cheekbones. "You want to know about the badge?" he said without looking at her. Elena settled onto a flat stone across the fire from him. "I want to know why you're not wearing it like you mean it." Caleb's mouth twisted in something that might have been a smile on another man's face. "Smart woman." He pulled a piece of jerky from his saddlebags and offered her half. "I was marshal of a little town called Silver Creek. Had a wife named Sarah. She was carrying our first child." The fire popped, sending sparks up into the darkening sky. Elena waited, sensing the weight of what was coming. Dutch owned cattle in those parts. His boys got drunk one night, decided to have some fun with the Mexican families living on the outskirts of town. "I arrested 3 of them." Caleb's voice stayed level, but Elena could see his knuckles whiten where he gripped the jerky. Dutch didn't like that. Said a white man's word was worth more than a Mexican's, and I should know my place. Elena's chest tightened. She'd heard similar words before, had felt their sting like a physical blow. "I told him the law was the law. Didn't matter what color a man's skin was." Caleb looked up at her then, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "That night, they burned down my house. Sarah was inside." The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water. Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. This man didn't need her pity. The town council said it was an accident. A lamp got knocked over, they said. Dutch's boys were playing cards at the saloon all evening. Plenty of witnesses. Caleb's laugh was bitter as ash. "Funny how much money can buy, including witnesses. But you kept the badge. Kept it to remind me. Justice ain't always found in courtrooms and juries. Sometimes a man has to make his own." Elena stared into the fire, watching the flames devour the dry wood. "And you think I'm part of that justice?" "I think Dutch Kessler takes things that don't belong to him. Always has." Caleb's voice softened slightly. "Maybe it's time someone took something from him." "I'm not a thing to be taken." "No," Caleb agreed, his eyes meeting hers across the flames. "You're not. But Dutch sees you that way. Sees everyone that way. Question is, what do you see when you look in the mirror?" Elena was quiet for a long moment. When Miguel died, she'd felt like something vital had been carved out of her chest. The auction block had been the final indignity, the last proof that the world saw her as nothing more than property to be bought and sold. "I see a woman who's tired of being afraid," she said finally. Caleb nodded slowly. "Fear's a useful thing, in small doses. Keeps you alive. But too much of it." He gestured at the vast desert around them. "Too much, and you forget you're already alive." A coyote called out somewhere in the darkness, its voice lonely and wild. Elena pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and watched Caleb's face in the firelight. There was something broken in him, she realized, but not shattered. Like a bone that had healed crooked but still bore weight. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked. "Tomorrow, we keep riding." He stretched out beside the fire, using his saddle as a pillow. "Dutch won't let this go. He'll come after us. Count on it." And then, Caleb was quiet for so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Then we find out what we're both made of, I reckon." Elena laid down on the hard ground, using her folded shawl as a pillow. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, bright and cold and infinitely distant. She thought about the woman she'd been this morning, desperate, defeated, willing to let herself be sold to the highest bidder. That woman felt like a stranger now. As sleep began to claim her, she wondered if running toward danger with a broken man was any kind of freedom at all, or just another kind of cage with wider walls. She thought he was just another outlaw seeking revenge, until she found the federal marshal's commission hidden in his saddlebags and realized everything she believed about him was a lie. The old Spanish mission rose from the desert floor like the skeleton of some ancient beast, its adobe walls cracked and weathered by decades of wind and rain. San Miguel de Los Angeles. The faded sign read, though most of the letters had been scoured away by sandstorms. Elena could see why Caleb had chosen this place. The thick walls would stop bullets, and the bell tower offered a view of anyone approaching across the flats. They'd been riding hard since dawn, the bay mare's flanks dark with sweat despite the early hour. Behind them, a dust cloud had been growing steadily larger, and Caleb's jaw had tightened with each backward glance. "How many?" Elena asked as they dismounted in the mission's courtyard. 6, maybe 7. Caleb pulled his rifle from its scabbard and checked the action. Dutch doesn't travel light when he's hunting. Elena felt her stomach clench. She'd seen what happened to people who crossed Dutch Kessler. Miguel had been careful never to give the cattle baron any reason to notice their small farm, but they'd both heard the stories. Men who disappeared in the night. Families who packed up and left town without saying goodbye. The mission's main chapel was a hollow shell, its roof long since collapsed and its altar crumbling. But the thick walls were solid, and the narrow windows would serve as gun ports. Caleb moved through the space with practiced efficiency, checking sight lines and escape routes. "There's a back way out through the sacristy," he said, nodding toward a low doorway. "If things go bad, I'm not running." Caleb stopped and turned to look at her. "Elena, this ain't your fight, isn't it?" She moved closer to him, her dark eyes flashing. "I was the one standing on that auction block. I'm the one Dutch thinks he owns. If that doesn't make it my fight, what does?" Before Caleb could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the desert. Elena peered through one of the narrow windows and saw them coming. 7 riders in a line, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. Dutch rode in the center on his big black stallion, his pale eyes fixed on the mission like a hawk watching a rabbit hole. "Caleb Rivers." Dutch's voice carried across the courtyard. "I know you're in there. Send out the woman, and maybe we can settle this like civilized men." Caleb pressed his back against the wall beside the window, his rifle ready. "Nothing civilized about you, Dutch," he called back. "Not since Silver Creek." Silver Creek was business, nothing personal. But this, Dutch's voice hardened. "This is stealing from me, and nobody steals from Dutch Kessler." Elena watched through the window as Dutch's men spread out, taking positions behind the mission's crumbling outbuildings. They moved with the easy confidence of men who'd done this before. Her mouth went dry. "Last chance, Rivers. The woman comes out, or we come in shooting." Caleb looked at Elena, his dark eyes serious. "He means it. Dutch doesn't bluff. Neither do you, I'm guessing." A smile ghosted across Caleb's lips. "No, ma'am. I don't." The first shot shattered the morning silence, the bullet gouging chunks from the adobe wall above Elena's head. She ducked instinctively as more shots followed, the narrow windows suddenly alive with muzzle flashes and the whine of ricocheting lead. Caleb returned fire with methodical precision, his rifle barking once, twice, 3 times. Elena heard a cry of pain from the courtyard and saw one of Dutch's men clutch his shoulder and stumble behind cover. "There's water in the sacristy," Caleb said between shots, not taking his eyes off the window. "And some old supplies the friars left behind. If we're stuck here long." Another volley of gunfire cut him off. Elena pressed herself against the wall and tried to think. 7 men against 2, with limited ammunition and no way out. The mathematics were grim. "Caleb," she said suddenly, "your saddlebags. When I was getting water this morning, I saw papers. Official-looking papers." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Elena, you're not just a marshal, are you?" Those looked like federal commissions. For a moment, the only sound was the distant crack of gunfire. Then Caleb lowered his rifle and looked at her with something like resignation. "U.S. Marshal," he said quietly. "Been working undercover for 2 years, building a case against Dutch and his operation. Rustling, murder, bribery. We got enough to hang him twice over." Elena stared at him. "Then why?" "Because Sarah was my wife, not just another victim in a case file." His voice was raw with old pain. "Because some debts can't be settled in courtrooms." A new voice cut through the gunfire, younger, uncertain. "Pa, there's someone coming from the east." Elena peered through the window and saw Dutch raise a spyglass, his face darkening as he studied the approaching figures. In the distance, she could make out riders, maybe a dozen of them, moving fast across the desert floor. "Federal marshals," Caleb said grimly. "Must have gotten my last message." Dutch's voice carried across the courtyard, tight with fury. "You set us up, Rivers. Just doing my job, Dutch." The shooting intensified, Dutch's men now firing desperately as they found themselves caught between the mission and the approaching lawman. Elena watched through the window as chaos erupted in the courtyard. Men running for their horses, shouting orders, the crack of rifles echoing off the mission walls. A stray bullet punched through the adobe near Caleb's head, and he shifted position, bringing his rifle to bear on a new target. But as he moved, Elena saw him stumble slightly, his left hand coming away from his side dark with blood. "Caleb, just a graze," he said through gritted teeth, but Elena could see the spreading stain on his shirt. "I'm fine." He wasn't fine. Elena could see the way he favored his left side, the pallor creeping into his face. Another bullet spanged off the wall, and Caleb returned fire, but his shot went wide. "Here," Elena said, taking the rifle from his hands. "Let me. You don't know how. Miguel taught me." She settled the stock against her shoulder and sighted down the barrel. Said a woman alone needed to know how to protect herself. The rifle kicked against her shoulder as she fired, and she saw one of Dutch's men dive for cover behind a water trough. She worked the lever action and fired again, driving another man away from the window he'd been shooting through. "Good shooting," Caleb said weakly. He was leaning against the wall now, his face gray with pain and blood loss. Elena kept firing, methodical and careful with each shot. Outside, she could hear the federal marshals getting closer, their voices carrying orders across the desert. Dutch's men were trapped now, caught between two forces with nowhere to run. "Elena," Caleb said softly. She glanced back and saw him sliding down the wall, his strength finally failing. The bloodstain on his shirt had spread, dark and wet. "Hold on," she whispered, torn between keeping watch and going to him. "Just hold on a little longer." Through the window, she saw Dutch himself break cover, running for his horse with two of his remaining men. The federal marshals were closing in, their rifles speaking with deadly accuracy. It was over, Elena realized. Dutch's empire was crumbling around him like the mission's ancient walls. But as she watched Dutch swing into his saddle, his pale eyes found hers through the window. Even at this distance, she could see the rage and promise of vengeance burning in his gaze. This might be over, but Dutch Kessler wasn't finished with them. Not by a long shot. In that crumbling chapel, with bullets flying and her rescuer bleeding out, she had to choose. Would she remain the broken woman from the auction block, or become the desert bride who fought for her own freedom? The mission's chapel felt like a sanctuary now, filled with the golden light of dawn streaming through the broken roof. Elena knelt beside Caleb on the dirt floor, her hands working quickly to bind his wound with strips torn from her petticoat. The federal marshals had secured the courtyard, their voices echoing off the adobe walls as they rounded up Dutch's remaining men. "Easy," Caleb murmured as Elena pulled the bandage tight. His face was pale, but his dark eyes were alert. "I've had worse." "When?" Elena asked, tried to keep her voice steady. "When have you had worse than this?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You don't want to know." Through the chapel's doorway, Elena could see Marshal Tom Bradley approaching, his silver badge catching the morning sun. She'd watch him arrive with his men like the cavalry in one of those dime novels. But victory felt hollow with Caleb bleeding beside her and Dutch Kessler still free. "Rivers," Bradley called as he entered the chapel. He was a lean man with graying hair and eyes like winter sky. "Heard you got yourself shot, playing hero." "Just doing the job," Caleb replied, struggling to sit up straighter against the crumbling altar. "Dutch, get away." Bradley's expression darkened. Him and two of his boys headed north toward the mountains. "We'll get him, though. Got enough evidence now to hang him 3 times over, thanks to your work." Elena listened to the men talk, but her attention was drawn to something else, a sound she couldn't quite place at first. Then she realized what it was. The mission bell, high in the tower above them, was moving in the desert breeze. Each gentle sway brought a soft, melodic chime that seemed to fill the ruined chapel with something like hope. "Ma'am," Bradley said, turning to her with a polite nod. I understand you've been through quite an ordeal. We can escort you back to Perdition Wells, or anywhere else you'd like to go. Elena looked down at her hands, still stained with Caleb's blood. I don't have anywhere to go. The auction, Caleb said quietly. It wasn't legal. Your husband's debts. We found the bank records in Dutch's papers. He was pressuring the bank president to foreclose, planning to buy your land for next to nothing. Elena felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. Miguel's farm. Still yours, Bradley confirmed. Dutch had the banker in his pocket, but federal law trumps local corruption. You can go home, ma'am. If you want to. Home. The word felt strange on Elena's tongue. For 6 months, she'd thought of the farm as a place of loss, haunted by Miguel's absence. But maybe that was just another kind of cage she'd built for herself. What about you? She asked Caleb. Where will you go when this is over? Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the broken crucifix above the altar. Don't rightly know. Been chasing ghosts so long, I forgot what it was like to think about tomorrow. Elena stood and walked to one of the narrow windows, looking out at the desert that stretched endlessly in all directions. The land was harsh and unforgiving, but it was also beautiful in its own way. Like the people who chose to make their lives here, it demanded respect rather than pity. Marshal Bradley, she said without turning around. Is there a preacher among your men? Bradley looked confused. A preacher? Well, Deputy Morrison used to minister before he took up the badge. Why? Elena turned back to face them, her chin raised with a determination that surprised even her. Because I think it's time this mission heard wedding vows again. Caleb stared at her, his dark eyes wide. Elena, you asked me what I see when I look in the mirror, she interrupted. I told you I see a woman tired of being afraid. But that's not all I see anymore. She walked back to where he sat against the altar, her bare feet silent on the dirt floor. I see a woman who's learned the difference between being claimed and choosing to belong somewhere. Between being bought and deciding her own worth. This ain't why I took you from that auction block, Caleb said softly. I didn't do it expecting anything in return. I know. Elena knelt beside him again, her hand finding his. That's exactly why I'm asking. The mission bell chimed again in the breeze, its voice carrying across the desert like a prayer. Elena thought about all the couples who might have been married in this chapel over the years, back when its walls were whole and its altar gleamed with polished wood. How many of them had found love in the most unlikely places? You sure about this? Caleb asked. His fingers were rough and scarred, but they held hers with surprising gentleness. I'm not an easy man to love. Got too much darkness in me. We all got darkness, Elena replied. Question is whether we're brave enough to let someone else help carry it. Bradley cleared his throat. Ma'am, if you don't mind my asking, you've known this man for less than 2 days. Elena smiled, the first real smile she'd felt since Miguel died. Marshal, I stood on an auction block yesterday morning, thinking my life was over. Now I'm in a ruined chapel, asking a wounded lawman to marry me while his blood is still on my hands. If that's not proof that life can change in a heartbeat, I don't know what is. An hour later, Deputy Morrison stood before them with his worn Bible, his voice carrying the old familiar words across the chapel. Elena had washed the blood from her hands in the mission's ancient well and braided wildflowers into her hair, desert blooms that grew in the cracks of the mission walls, finding life in the most impossible places. Caleb had insisted on standing for the ceremony, though Elena could see the effort it cost him. When Morrison asked if he took Elena to be his wife, his voice was clear and strong. Ido. When it was Elena's turn, she thought about the woman who had stood on that auction block, desperate and defeated. That woman felt like someone she'd known long ago, in another life. I do, she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. When they kissed, the mission bell rang out across the desert, carried by a sudden gust of wind that seemed to come from nowhere. Elena tasted dust and hope and the promise of tomorrow on Caleb's lips. Later, as Bradley's men prepared to head north in pursuit of Dutch, Elena helped Caleb toward their horses. The bay mare stood patiently in the mission courtyard, her reins trailing in the dust. "Where to Mrs. Rivers?" Caleb asked, and Elena felt a warm flutter in her chest at the sound of her new name. She looked out at the desert, then back at the mission with its crumbling walls and ancient bell. "Home," she said. "We're going home. Your farm. Our farm." Elena smiled and helped him into the saddle, then swung up behind him. Miguel always said the desert flowers were the most beautiful because they had to fight so hard to bloom. As they rode away from the mission, Elena looked back once at the bell tower silhouetted against the morning sky. The bell was still now, quiet in the desert air, but she knew she'd carry its song with her forever. Behind them, the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Ahead lay whatever tomorrow would bring: Dutch's eventual capture, the hard work of rebuilding a farm, the daily choice of loving a complicated man with ghosts in his past. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena Rivers wasn't afraid of tomorrow. She was ready to meet it head-on, with dust in her hair and hope in her heart, and a man beside her who'd learned that some things were worth fighting for. The desert stretched endlessly around them, harsh and beautiful and full of possibilities, like love itself.